hold it height. Can everybody hear me fine? Excellent, thank you. So thank you very much for asking me to speak today. I will keep turning my head, so shout at me if I do that too much. I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've done in my part of my PhD. I still used to work for a record centre and do some public engagement, so it's a mishmash. But please have in mind some of the talks we've had earlier today too, because there's some of my motivation about engagement, practicality, applied methods. So firstly, I'll put a thank you slide at the beginning. I'm a lot more generous with Richard's photo than he was with mine, if only I'd have known earlier. But I am also very thankful to have the opportunity to have studied PhD at DICE through a 50th anniversary scholarship, which was very enjoyable. I know it might not seem to my colleagues that go through at the moment, but definitely an achievement. And I'm also lucky enough to be doing a postdoc relating to well-being and biodiversity, mainly in women. So I was going to start with the citizen science. This again is one of those things that got a whole field all about it. But what I wanted to look at here is, although it covers lots of different areas, I don't particularly like the term. I think it gives us a nice umbrella term, community science, citizen science. But when I think of people collecting data, I still think of us as amateur naturalists and the kind of things that went on way before any of these terms ever came to fruition. So if you think back to Darwin, collecting stuff, I'm sure if I was a very rich gentleman and people made my day think up, I'd have more time to discover things. But the world we live in today, we've already heard about the well-being and people being involved and encouraged to be outside. So I think citizen science means a lot of different things to a lot of people. But what I want to think about today is the way you can have something that's bottom-up, which is where people organise themselves and have an idea and try and get people involved from the bottom when you're on the ground. Or you can also have top-down, where you have people that arrange, not necessarily professional scientists, but people who arrange projects and are organised for which you can join in. So if you do want to find out more about citizen science or want to look at maybe delivering a project of any kind, there's these two publications that are free online, come from Central Ecology and Hydrology and also from the Record Centre, are really, really useful. Citizen science and volunteering occur across the spectrum in all sorts of ways. This is just a screenshot from the Platforms Universe, if anybody's come across it. As you can see from there, loads of things going on. You've got historical things, and at the top it's got the categories: arts, biology, climate. So people can get involved in many different ways. But much of it now is visual. It relies on images and image matching. And one of the things that I think is a take-home message is one of the early projects where it came up, it was matching galaxies, so it's image matching for galaxies, and this particular lady flagged up that she kept seeing these little blue spots and there wasn't anything in her training guide to tell her what it was. When it fed back, it was an astronomical unit that was new to science, and then they named it after her. So this thing is called Annie's Object. I'm not going to insult anyone. So there's lots of things that people can offer in different ways, and it's not necessarily something you know until you deliver something, and then people bring their experiences to you as much as the other way around. So how reliable is the data? There's lots of different criticisms. I've sat in a meeting in Europe of which a professor from the German institution said citizen science data is rubbish, and what I pointed out to him is it just really meant that it's maybe something that he can use. And a quote from this paper is, even though it says can volunteers do real research, a quote from the paper quite nicely puts, if you show someone, which is true of life, if you just take the time to show someone, it's not necessarily difficult, it's just the way that you engage people, the way you deliver it. And the important thing about data as well, I mean, I belong to local recording groups, and I know a lot of the data we collect goes into information that goes towards decision making. And so we've got, well, there's an advert for a PhD on the left, you can see some biological records that are collected. It can go into, we do occupancy modelling at work, there'll be presence, absence, there'll be habitat suitability, so it feeds into many, many different realms. But one thing that I do notice in that when projects are, well, even with data collection, there never seems to be any room for the fact that the data you're collecting isn't necessarily 100% true. So not to say that people's ID skills are rubbish, but it's also something to think about in that what you're feeding in matters. So if you're not checking what goes in, are you extrapolating the errors when you start modelling with that data? And ultimately, if we don't know what exists where or how they interact, how are we going to make informed decisions that are optimised on the ground? So how hard can it be? This is an example of one of the platforms. It's comparing whale tails. What's interesting with this is that the quote here says volunteers are sometimes more accurate than scientists. And what they're doing here is getting loads of people to look at images and see if they can find the individuals. But of course, when you have an image, you're not looking at matching images as in it's the same like Snap. What you're looking at is matching what's in the image. And here you can see at the top picture, it looks like a bit of a cloudy day. The colours are really bright, you can see the markings. But the bottom picture looks like it's a sunny day, has given us shadows. And so there's lots of things that you maybe look out or characteristics. Once you get your eye in, that's where expertise and familiarity come to play. And I'm sure that once you start looking at a huge database, these are the tricks that you pick up on. So again, species identification, although some people would use, as it is in the field, like with this cartoon that does make me laugh, about what you would look at. You might look at butterfly, then start to look at different markers, and has it got the spots? But also some people will go by use a probability rather than an absolute species identification because of where it's found, how it flies. So I appreciate that there's many other factors in identification. It's not just to do with images. But also animals are there to catch us out. If you imagine they have different life cycles, there's different stages in which you might find an individual. This is a nice take from, I don't have kids by the way, I have a supervisor that has kids that gave all these hints in the PhD. And we're familiar with life cycles of butterflies and caterpillars because they appear a lot in our children's literature when we were younger. But also, you then have life cycles of something like a jellyfish, which you're not so familiar with. And how would you necessarily match an image or a diagram like that with something that you might find as an individual part? And then we also have all the other tricks, melanism, on something simplistic, all the different colour morphs, and also sexual dimorphism. And some of the traps we fall into is there's a pattern, except when it's not like that, which is the beauty of biology. It's always like this, except when it's not, which I think, again, is the hardest thing when you're training people or engaging people. And I picked this picture of these two parrots because it's the Electus parrot, and the male and the female are brightly coloured. But at one point, it was thought that they were two separate species, because for most other parrots, you don't necessarily have that bright colour forms in both the sexes when there is dimorphism. So there's lots of trickery that's, if you're not familiar with the species, you wouldn't necessarily know, but when you are familiar, you have an idea about. And familiarity is also important to find out when there's misinformation. So if you can read at the bottom of this slide, the efforts to repopulate the Iberian lynx have been incredibly successful. Unless you've magicked an Iberian lynx into a bobcat, then they have. So this appeared on LinkedIn, and why would you know? Unless you're familiar with either species, you need to be familiar with something to know well enough that the other one isn't. So when you have a comparison like this, it's a beautiful diagram. But like with a lot of things, if you're looking at an ID guide, it's very comparative in wording. So this pointer doesn't work. But if you have a look at the point of the tail, longer tail, or longer than what? Longer than other lynx, longer than my dog. And again, on the foot. So again, when you're writing guides or you're introducing some kind of training, because you're aware of how some of the species fits in with each other, you will know. But if you're not familiar with those species, it doesn't necessarily mean anything longer than. And let's face it, when are you going to see those two guides together? There's no scale in the actual inset of the picture from LinkedIn. There's no scale on the picture of the two animals. So It's hard to know which information to put in, but the more familiar you become with something, I think sometimes you have to watch that you don't become, you move away from maybe putting those hints and tips that you think are an accepted part of identifying something or a knowledge that everybody has. And with ID guides, we have something like Bumblebee's Conservation Concern. So you've got these beautiful ID guides, and then you have a picture. And the reality is, again, you can take bees, you can have a sample, you can stick it in your pot and look. But what's the way of getting lots and lots of data? And there's a trade-off between wanting individual, like Bumblebee Conservation Trust will take people out and do some training, or the fact that you have an image, you can send it to an expert around the other side of the world, you can log it, you can both look at the image and discuss it. It's something that's kept in time rather than immediate capture. Really. So everything has its strengths and weaknesses. But do people think this is the same or different image on the pictures on the right? Go on, shout out, Aldi.
Different.
Thank you, yeah, different species. And even though you start to go down, you can see that in the abdomen it's slightly different shades of the images, but the reality is when you have a photo where the abdomen's curved and the photo is a natural way of resting, it's not always easy to see. And with the rise in digitisation and the importance of some specimens, of which some organisations, it may be the only specimen they have, this is a screenshot from Twitter where someone's obviously not very happy with the bees being mounted. So there's lots of things to think about if you're trying to transfer your expertise or get people engaged in what you're doing. Because it's not just the physiology of looking at something, but it's also what you look at that matters. And of course with psychology, you have people who think they know nothing, but they're quite competent. And the reality, I think, is that everyone has something to give. We just work differently, we look at different things. And then you have, I don't know if anybody's come across the Dunning-Kruger effects. It's a really nice graph of the nuances between introducing somebody new to a field of knowledge, any field of knowledge. So you start, and you think, yeah, I've got this. They sent me this package through, and they said it's either A or B that occurs on the coast, and I've definitely seen A, so it must be that. Or even better, which I do know of, is where someone went out and they looked at A or B, and what happened is they recorded everything as B because they knew it wasn't A. And that doesn't necessarily work. But because within their knowledge base, their training guide gave them two options, so they choose the one that they knew they hadn't looked at. But as you start to go into something, you know that there's lots more, or it's a lot more convoluted, and it's complicated. And to study this, I used face recognition techniques, so my supervisor was in psychology. And rather than image match, as you said before, what they do is they take the image of one person and then match it against different images of the same person under different conditions, which I think is the reality. If you took a photo of a species, you would then matching it to an illustration or a photo from someone else. And it turns out people aren't very good at this, but they are if you're familiar with it. So one of my tasks was we asked experts and non-experts, but we had conservation interest and non-conservation interest, non-experts. So it's three categories, but where some people maybe don't do it as a job, they do have an interest. And 60 images, people had to say, yes, the same, but again, it's not the same image. You'll see in the top, they're the same species, but they're from different illustrated guides. So the bottom one is a different species, and that may seem obvious at first, because it's got the nice yellow stripe on the back, but accuracy was less than 60% overall, and there wasn't that much difference between the experts and non-experts. And it's not a naming task, it literally is an image matching. And what also comes out of facial recognition is that you have these amazing people with super recognisers. So has anyone here attended the ID course? Yeah? Is anyone who attended an ID course got tested on what they knew before the training began? So what could well happen is that you just have the knack. Some people just have the knack, but the problem is it's really hard to test, because if you test with someone and it shows that the training hasn't improved their customers, they're not going to pick up people necessarily want to publish it. But it is something to think in mind, is that, is it your training is good, or is it the people who have just good at what they do? And then also introducing the concept of differences. You can have species that are new to science, with, you think of all the changes we talked about already with climate change, distributions are changing quickly. What was typical in your field guide that was written 5 or 10 years ago may not be typical now. You can have maps online, but how often are they updated? How is our distribution knowledge of certain species recorded? So again, it's hard to say to people is that we just want you to look for this in our little project, in our little area, but there's all these considerations. So you don't want to blow their mind, but also what you don't want to do is give any participants the kind of Dunning-Kruger effect of, like, this is all I need to know, it's easy. So mammals don't come that often, I don't think, for a new species, but I think this might be a Lazarus species where it's gone extinct and come back again. And then again, there's a lot of work on non-native species and if they're invasive, and this is a great test. Do you think it's left or right? But the reality is how many people get the chance to put them both together. If you saw one on their own, and again with the wildlife don't like books, we do. So you can have an overlap of ranges, so you can have a typical weight, typical length, typical tail length, but there will be overlap between male and female, and there will be overlap between different species. And again, that's fine. If you're doing something that's maybe right with bats, all bats are protected, so it's fine. But if you're doing a population study or a range study, you're going to need to know those specifics to be able to make better decisions. So one of the other tasks we did is we invited Great Crested licence holders to do a sort task. What they had is 80 images, so it was 4 species, 3 native, 1 non-native. And all they had to do is sort their piles into what they thought were the same species, known as a free sort. And what we found was, that's obviously jumped around, and it's not how it looked in mine, so that doesn't tell you much, but if you do want to have a look, I have the papers here, let's have a look, is the middle two, what you found is that across the top, so the 4 species there's photos of, they were the 4 that occurred, and down the left-hand side, we had what people guessed at. So most people got Great Crested right, most people got Alpine, which is the top left-hand corner one. And then there was a lot of confusion between the two, and some people thought they were hybrids or other species. But the beauty with this as well is that, well, as we saw earlier with Richard's talk, a lot of the ID guides have these beautiful press, backlit, swimming in the water, all this beautiful imagery of what the species are. But if you have a look, you'll be walking over something in the dark, even if it's looking with a torch, you might not be able to see its underside. If it's out on land, it might have its secondary sexual characteristics of press, but the water's not there, so it flaps over. So again, it's not always easy for people to pick up on what the characteristics are, because what you see in an ID guide is not often what you see in the field. And if anybody wants to read a bit about experts and expertise, the article on the left is written by Phil Sutherland and Mark Bergman, and it's about using experts wisely. And as we've seen so far, it's not just what you know, it's what is known within the community. It's something that we'll know. It doesn't matter how much you've learned something, there'll always be someone you have an argument or disagree, or you'd only have to do a paper on the subject once if we all knew what we were doing straight away. So it's a learning process for everyone. The trusting judgments is really good. It shows not only how people have got it wrong, but how they've continually got it wrong as it's gone through the system, because the peer-appointed expert didn't get it right and no one wants to question it. So there's lots of these different human elements as well as actual reality and ideas. But one paper I came across, part of the PhD, that I really liked, is a way of training and transferring expertise in medicine. So these pictures here, on the left, it's a set of lungs, it's carved up into areas, and what they did is the experts and the radiologists wore eye tracking goggles, and as they looked across the chest, it tracked where people looked and how one fall, and that was used as a way to train trainees, because if you have a look, nearly most, at least the top third of the image and the bottom third of the image, and not where the eyes go. But it could be that when you get so used to doing something your way, when you try to explain to someone, it may well be that you're not actually telling them what you're doing with your eyes as well. So I'd love to do this with taxonomy and collections, but I just need to find things. If anyone's got some spare change down the back of the sofa. And weirdly, this week when I was getting this talk together, I found I'd say it's a note more than a study, but it was from academic radiology that I'd never come across before. And it was showing what radiologists use, it's American, what radiologists use in their work could be something that benefits them, part of their well-being, when they go out. And as you can see, there's arrows at the woodpecker's tail, top and bottom, like I say, it's American bird. But it shows the connection there. And again, it's not what you look at, it's what you see. And the media doesn't help in that you've got people coming to you who think they know everything because they've seen something on the news. The left is a shot from June this year about reintroduction of turtle doves, as we've seen with previous talks. That's actually turtle doves on the right. And then the shot here on the left, again on Twitter, was about spotted hyenas, and I actually showed the pictures or a video of African wild dogs, painted dogs, and that's hyenas on the right. Now, I'm not sure if it's laziness, and the other thing to remember as well, sometimes when you do a search online, the algorithms will come up with something connected. So even if you search for, say, great crested newts, it doesn't necessarily come up with that image. What it can do is the algorithm's links will show you other images of newts. And I think some people just look at the picture and go with it. So if you are engaging people, there's going to be the kind of Dave wanting to on Twitter that knows everything, and it might be hard to undo what they've come across before. But ultimately, I wanted to point out that expert isn't thing fixed in time. I like the word expertise because it's dynamic. You've got new information coming out, whether it be from a paper, from a study, from your colleagues. I mean, we all have anecdotal work. We can't necessarily present it because it's not evidence. And so we have to stick with what has been evidenced, for which people need money. And so it's a mix of what we know to be true, what we know to be likely, that this can change. So you have people coming in to a field, whatever the field of knowledge is, you have people dropping out of it, and it's a community of practice. So even if you sit on the periphery of the community, as it's shown here, it doesn't mean to say that you don't have the knowledge, but you have to remember that there's always a human element within it. And I wanted to finish with this quote from the paper, in that expertise matters. So even though this relates to facial recognition, it's not just the fact that you can just point at something. No, it's what you look for. It's your experience in the field that makes you know which features work, which features don't work, and to what you can look for. And those are the things that I think that can be transferred to other people. But I think that what you need to do if you're having any kind of project, try not to take one off the shelf. Take one for inspiration, but have a look at what your aims and your outputs are, and maybe recruit your audience accordingly, because it could well be you're looking for something that's quite specific. And I know someone who's doing a study on cicadas in the New Forest that apparently have been extinct about 17 years ago, so I'm not entirely sure what he's looking for. But you could have something when you have the RSPB or Big Line Birdwatch. Well, that's great, because you've got loads of data, and there may be stuff that you discount or want to follow up. It's easy and it's volumes of data. So have a think about what you want from it, what training you can offer, and maybe adjust it accordingly, or work with the bottom up with your participants. Thank you very much.